Chapter 8 as part of our conversation in the scriptures tonight. Probably moving our way all the way through chapter 15, but not by any means going verse to verse or bit by bit. We're going to be looking at a couple of the major events in this period of the time of Israel and making some connections between this part of 1 Samuel and some of the earlier stories of Israel that we've read from Judges, from Deuteronomy, from Numbers. But at this time, we're going to ask Les, if he will, to lead us in opening prayer. Les?
Heavenly Father, we're so thankful unto you for this time that we can come together in the middle of our week to take this time to study your word. Pray, Father, that you'll help us be able to learn the things that we study, that you intended us to learn from your word, and be able to apply it to our lives in a proper manner. And thank you for taking care of us, keeping those of us that are here safe. Pray that you'll continue to be with us. Pray that you'll be with those that are not able to be here, especially with Rich and Lori Brown. Help them to recover from the virus quickly to your will. Pray, Father, that you'll be with all of our families and keep us all safe. Pray that you'll help us all to look to you for our strength and our comfort and our guidance and all the trials and tribulations that we go through in this life. We know that's the only place we can find true comfort is through you. Pray that you'll be with Philip as he leads this class and help him to say things in a simple manner where it be easy understood. Pray, Father, that you'll be with those in other congregations that we know about that are having health difficulties and other difficulties. Be your will, you'll bless all our brothers and sisters in Christ. You'll forgive us for our sins. Thank you for your grace and your mercy. In Christ's name.
Amen. So one of the things I want to start with here as we open up the text is to think through some of the connections I've mentioned already. We've got some important commentary that takes place in chapter 8. We've got some character examinations that start in chapter 9, and we have the conflict that comes afterwards. Because in this section, in this kind of the portions that we're looking at, there are three main things. So if you want to take some notes or write down, really it's all focused heavily on Saul, wherein Saul is anointed, Saul is affirmed, but in the end, Saul is abandoned. And as a king, that tracks the rise and fall of whom he is. You remember looking at the growth of the physical power of Israel in this era. It bounces out from Saul to David to Solomon. Last time, remember, we had taken a little bit to look at the travels of the ark and how that kind of set the stage for what we're going through right now. So I'm just bringing this up real quick as a quick reminder of this is kind of what's happened. It's cycled through the series of conflict. Eventually we'll kind of remind ourselves of its return at different points because it will thematically help teach parts of the story of Israel. One of the key things to recognize in this quick look back is very simple. Israel thought that the ark was the source of their victory or their power, whereas God should have been the source of their victory and power. And yet God demonstrates his power in each of these settings, even at times when Israel itself is being chastised or humbled through these processes. So when we get to chapter 8, which is where we're kind of starting at this point, one of the things you can think about in the sense of moving from Judges to Saul is to think about this text as a bit of a commentary. And what I mean by that is it gives us insight into two sections of the Bible we already looked at in detail. That's Deuteronomy chapter 16 and Deuteronomy chapter 17. In those sections of the text, the law of God explains guidelines or principles for Judges, chapter 16, verses 18 through 20, and Kings, chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. And so there is already built in by God, even though there was not a king yet, standard expectations for leadership and standard expectations for the kind of leadership that would be present in Israel going forward, even though that hasn't been identified, even though the pressure for it seems to come from inside of Israel rather than God putting it upon them in that sense. But he already set a standard for them. In that commentary, what you see happen, thinking back, is maybe 4 or 5 key things. Quickly, from the top to the bottom, there's an obvious failure of leadership that's kind of exhibiting itself in Israel. Failed leaders like Eli on the prophet-priest side of thing, failed local leadership in the tribes that should have been rising to the roles of tribal leadership and leading. And if you want to think about it, by the way, in a more familiar context, we're really talking about the difference between national government and state-level government, county-level government, city-level government in a concept. And so there's deep failure both at the national level, the prophet in the Eli context, the priest in the Eli context, but also in the communal leadership of the tribal spaces, where the tribes had their land broken out and delineated, and this is our section and your section. The judge's model of failure is kind of what they know and what they practice. In that, they perceive our solution has to come from a leader like the nations around us. And I want us to kind of pay attention to some of the things that take place in thinking about it, because Saul is the solution that they ask. And by the way, they get exactly what they're looking for. They get the king they want, but he's not the king that they need. And we'll see some of the key criteria in a second when we look through in chapter 9, when we think about Saul individually. He's also kind of someone who is not on the scene spiritually. And through the overall layers of this switch from tribal prophet leadership to king structural leadership, their first king is someone who seems incredibly unconnected or disconnected from spiritual concepts. He doesn't know much about their cultural regulations. He doesn't know much about the spiritual side of the law. He's not even known to the priest in that sense. His family isn't known. Basic concepts of the Torah's expectation, diet, as mentioned, but also military conduct are kind of foreign to him. And so he is a physical insider in some ways, but a spiritual outsider. He doesn't seem to have the grasp of what's going on. The last half of chapter 8, by the way, really is kind of showing the full rejection of the last parts of how it used to be. You get all the judges rolled off the page. The lack of a real Torah or law-based pattern of leadership is being rolled off the page. And then Israel demands its king. We want a king like the nations around us. And there's a whole dialogue that takes place inside that text of what to expect. Samuel lays it out. He says things like, as a quick reminder, they're going to tax stuff. There's going to be an emphasis on a layer of bondage because there's going to be service that takes place within the context of their military service and their obligations. And so there's going to be some of that. And so also going into this is the next step down the road, you've got the expectation of, well, now we're going to be like all the nations around us. We're going to kind of latch into that context and that space. Now, moving into the next part of that, we've got some things to think about in that section of the text. Think about the contrast of good leaders and bad leaders. You've got godly leaders, and then you've got ones that are ungodly and how that affects the nation. For a long time, you may have heard or thought through things like, does character count? Does character count for the leadership of Israel? Well, yeah, it's like a simple one. Certainly it does. Good kings, bad kings. So our moral fiber does influence the nature of the places around us spiritually and with a sense of like rules and law. If there's not a good moral leader, you're going to expect immorality in that kingdom, in that household. It's a pretty simple principle, but it plays out in this section. It also plays out in the Kings pretty clearly as well. Which leads us to chapter 9. And I think there's some important principles to think about that maybe, I know I didn't always read the first time I was reading through chapter 9, but as you slow down and read the text, there's some interesting points that are like obvious once you know or remember. And for me, it's remember. I have to keep notes about stuff. But remember the question. They wanted a king like the nations around them, right? So we tend to think about that, and I know I thought about that in that list of things that Samuel identified. King like the nation around them. Well, that means taxing. That means war. That means leadership like that. It means slavery in the Egyptian sense. But did you notice two principles that take place in chapter 9 and verse 2? This descendant or comparison of the land of Kish, chapter 9, verse 1, which, by the way, means that he's coming from a well-to-do family or folks with money. That's what that concept kind of implies there. It's similar to Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1 for the family of Boaz. It means, in this context, his family likely owns slaves, donkeys, oxen. There's a lot of physicality to that. But verse 2, Saul is more handsome, and it says, chapter 9 and verse 2, he's taller than his brothers. Okay, so we say, well, kings should be tall, right? That's the takeaway from that. Think back to the conquest of Israel going into the land of Canaan, and what was the specific push to remove from that land? Is there a specific group of people that are super powerful there? Well, and in particular, the Nephilim, the giants are ruling. There's even a whole thing about Joshua and a giant had to be slain. And Saul then is written as being like that kind of king. He is taller than his brothers. In essence, the text is giving us this picture and it says, here's your king. He's like the nations around you. He even looks like the nations around you, as opposed to an Israelite king. So if you're thinking about this in the terms of music, and you're watching a movie or listening to a story on the radio, this is when the foreboding, foreshadowing music comes on. And it's like really low and a little bit off key and off center. And you're like, oh, okay, this doesn't feel right. There's something not right about it. So in a literary sense, this picture is telling us by God's kind of plan, hey, I'm telling you that this guy isn't like you. And Israel takes it as a good thing. I would suggest it might be important for us to think through it on the other end of the table and say, maybe that's actually the bad thing, in that he isn't like us. And by the way, throughout Deuteronomy, throughout Numbers 13, verse 33, Numbers 1, 28, Numbers 2, verse 10, you see this sense of the physical disparity between the average Israelites and the Canaanites is a marker. And so on the sense of why is Saul taller than the other guys around him? A good possibility that his family had married into those other individuals as a possible way to think about it. And I don't think married in the sense of literally he has a family line that forks away from Israel per se. His behavior most certainly is not Israelite throughout the layers of his interaction with Israel. All of his conflict is very much centered on him not doing what an Israelite should do as a king of Israel. The next thing that happens then in the story layout is this, in chapter 9, is an interesting tidbit in verse 3 about him losing his father's donkeys. You ever wonder why that's there? I'll raise my hand. I wonder why everything's there. Like when any story comes, like, why is this story the story that's given? So think through the idea of a culture that really values shepherding, and like rural roots. And the first story that they choose by inspiration or maybe thinking about it, the first story we read right now about his family is they can't keep track and protect their vast herds. Is that similar or opposite to anything else we read in the scriptures? So you got Saul over here. They can't contain. He's not a good herdsman for his father's donkeys. How do we get David introduced to us? What do we think about David? There's two great stories for him. What's the first one? Comes to your mind right away. He was a good shepherd. He was such a good shepherd, he was prepared for the conflict of going against a giant who wasn't like them, who looked like their king but wasn't like them. And so you see this contrast already as a tension in the text. Saul, who looks like the kings everywhere else, isn't the good shepherd. When we meet David, a couple of times he gets introduced in different senses. He's a good shepherd. He's an encourager. Further, we also see that David's perception of the world is from one who does the work, by the way. He actually is out in the field tending his father's possessions. And Saul seems very distant. And we're not even cued in this story in here in chapter 9, verse 3, on exactly what his role is in this. He's more like the money manager who's coming in rather than the actual shepherd who cares and tends for the herd that is in that whole ensemble of his family's possessions and settings. So that kind of helps us then, consider and look at the next thing. Saul is now shown to us here also in chapter 9 as really kind of, again, on the spiritual edge of things because Saul is from the town of Gibeah. And if you remember from Judges chapter 19, this is not a place where spirituality is known to come from. In fact, it's from the opposite of that, from Judges 19, verses 22 through 26. So then that sets up the stage. This is the guy we get. So the king they asked for, after rejecting their genuine leadership, both through the appointed judges, they failed in a kind of accomplishing that, it seems. They failed spiritually in many ways. They asked for a king like the nations around them. The king that has been then presented looks like the other nations. He behaves like the other nations. And by the way, he leads them like the other nations did. Because do we consider in the overall arc of Saul's life him being a good king or a bad king? That's like one of the simple things. Is Saul a good king or a bad king? Spiritually speaking or otherwise?
Seems like to me he started off being a good king and he turned bad.
Had a good start. And then the lack of spiritual formation created these series of events where either by not knowing what he was supposed to do or boldly choosing to do what he shouldn't do, there's a calamity that follows each time. He stops being the king that he needs to be and tries to do things that aren't suitable for him in his familial role. He's not a priest. He's not from a priestly tribe. You see all of that slowly unfurl itself in a sequence of events that leads eventually to his demise. In chapter 10, we see Saul being anointed as king. Notice a couple highlights of Saul as king, and maybe you caught these in your readings. Chapter 10, verse 17, the text has a speech that has him coming up. Now Samuel it is called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to the people of Israel, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all those kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God who saves you from your calamities and your distresses, and you have said to him, set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves to the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands." There's an interesting kind of bounce back and forth there where by the text it's telling us, hey, they've rejected their true king. You're now going to be numbered and counted as a kind of an accountability for your behavior. And you're going to come up by your tribes and by your thousands. Remember that from the earlier studies of Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Is numbering Israel a good thing? From our reading of the earlier parts of the Bible, should that be something that they should be doing of their own volition? No. But now God, through the prophet, is requiring that they do so. But in this case, it's a picture of censure. They're going to be accounted for their behavior. And this is a good point to recognize he is God's anointed. He is God's chosen. But he's still a mixed bag. Because as we read through the text, is he, again, a bad king destined for failure? Is he a good king destined for success? Is a question that a couple of folks have posed different ways. That all kind of sets the stage for what happens next. Because remember, in our series of consideration, we've got him anointed, appointed as king, but eventually there's going to be some severing of that responsibility. And if you remember reading through the text, we think about him being Israel's first king, we kind of begin to capture or recognize in all of this what it is that God will be accomplishing, because this kingship cycle is just starting with Saul. And then it's supplanted or subverted by David. And it's David's line that we follow. But that ebb and flow, that rise and fall, it repeats, right? Or you might have a good king, or you might have a king who honors God and it rises, and then a king that dishonors God and it falls. That cycle that we saw in Judges will now play itself out in two ways going forward. Way number one is that you will see it very intimately in the lives of specific kings. Mainly, a lot of this section of the history of Israel focuses on the three kings, we three kings of old. The King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. They, in the whirlwind of their lives, play out Judges over and over again. But what happens is we see that their lives spin up or diminish the nation. So as the king goes, so goes the nation. Just as when we read through the prophets, they will talk about how the spiritual formation of Israel is heavily impacted by the same whirlwind that occurs in the spiritual leadership of Israel, in the priests, and even in the prophets. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed this, it was a little side point. Reading through the rise and appointment of Saul, did you notice how he saw and thought about prophets? He sees them in much the same way as the pagans do around them, that prophets basically are paid to perform, and that you can buy them to behave in a certain way. Is that counter narrative to what God's prophets should be doing? Yeah, God's prophets should simply be saying, God told me to do this, and I say that. It even tells us multiple story forms of what happens if a prophet tries to not speak like God. Well, here's a donkey. Donkey will stop you. Here's the consequence of prophesying against God, etc. We see that picture played out. When you have a king who thinks that God's prophets are like the prophets of a nation, that's also another thing to think about, his rise and fall and where that all fits in. Also, in thinking through, say, chapter 14, 15 range of this overall batch of the text, here's some other things we can kind of lay in there in this, thinking about Saul as the anointed and appointed king before everything falls apart for him. He is leading in the way that you would expect a king generally to lead. He raises an army, but does he feel like his army is sufficient to take on the Philistines? Is he really confident in what he's done? doesn't seem to be very confident in the success model. Think about it from this way. When Jesus uses the illustration of going to conflict, going to war for kings, what is the model that's suggested there? I've got an army, and Bobby has an army, and we're two kings. And so I have my army here, and I'm going to go out to fight against Bobby. What should I be doing before I determine whether we're going to step to the field of the battle? Ask God, should I go? I'm going to count the cost as well, all right? Those two things are going to be coming into play. If I don't hear an answer from God one way or the other, but I count the cost, and I've got, 200 footmen, some chariots, and some archers, and a couple of slingers. And Bobby's coming in, and he's got 4,000 chariots, 6,000 foot, and to move it into a modern trope, he also has the high ground. Should I go up to war against Bobby, or should I sue for peace and make a treaty? I'm going to have to pick peace because God hasn't answered, and I'm pretty certain that I'm overwhelmed in that context. When we encounter the various stages of Saul's leadership, we see him in both of these positions. Sometimes he has overwhelming force, and he's successful. Or sometimes he's asking God, and he's successful in that context. But also when we see him in the middle space with David, they're stale. They're held. He's not advancing. And in fact, what's the morale level of the Israelites at that point, by the way? Are they excited to go fight against this giant? No, it's the opposite. They're like, yeah, I'm good. We're going to stay right here. They're going to stay over there. He's going to taunt us. Basically, if you want to have the most humorous illustration of that taunting, and this is actually a good way to understand the literal nature of these conflicts, there was the old Monty Python movie, The Quest for the Holy Grail. It's a really silly, farcical comedy, but they have a whole thing about taunting. And one of the taunts is, your mother smells of elderberries. And that's actually a good sense of the kind of taunting that takes place historically in these pitched battles, where they do stand out and they make mockery of at least two things. The first one is usually about the ability of their army to beat your army. But the actual real serious one in conflicts that tend to involve this reason are very simple. Our God's stronger than your God, if you want to narrow it down. And so that's the conflict context that you're seeing played out. By the way, some of these conflicts may have been early on, and as Saul is rising to power, some of the largest battles of that era in that region. Archaeologists are pointing out that they're finding huge strewn battlefields at some of these sites. Some of the potential sites even for the location of David's epic conflict for Goliath are just strewn with the same kind of remnants we find now in different contexts from, say, Civil War battlegrounds. And if you go to a Civil War site, you can still sometimes find shot in the trees. Metal detectors will find stuff in the dirt sometimes still. And sometimes you can even find arrows from eras before that, arrowheads, old flint chip arrowheads. So they're still finding the reality that some of these conflicts were massive. And when you talk about armies, as the text would render in various senses, including maybe up to 3,000 chariots, can you visualize what 3,000 of anything looks like? It's difficult, right? Especially when we're not necessarily going to places where there's large crowds. But 3,000 is 3 times the population of Madras Middle School right now. So that's 3 middle schools is 3,000. Or right now that might be, I can't remember what East Coweta's size is, real close to that. They're about 3,000. Now that's 3,000 students in that middle school, or that high school. But they're not just students, it's their chariots, it's their horse team, like it's a whole ensemble. And that's just one component of one side of one of these conflicts. They're all engaged in this whole conflict range, which, if you remember, this is part of the reason why under the first steps of Saul, you see this territorial push where things are getting bigger and stronger and more power rich in this area. And yet, his moral compass is seemingly broken. And that kind of leads us towards thinking about the last edge of this, where Saul's behavior underneath the narrative elements of conflict of war, leadership issues. We see David pop up a couple different ways in the kingdom of Saul. And we'll talk about David quite a bit next Wednesday night too, and think about some of the things with him. Saul's not a very great guy. There's a good reason why we see his full moral calamity. When David is engaged in soothing the heart of Saul before he runs off to Achish of Gath in his kind of tour around Israel to go hide, he tries to kill him. Not just once, multiple times. And David's heart is different than Saul's heart at this point, because David acknowledges still that Saul is still the anointed of God. He's still serving in that role. So before we cover anything else, and I want to kind of go back in chapter 15 in a second and talk about 14 and 15 for a moment. Some of the questions we've been tending to ask recently and kind of re-engage are real basic questions about the text. So in this section, chapters 8 through 15, as a narrative part of the Old Testament, did you guys find anything super interesting to you that you hadn't noticed in your readings before or was just important? I'll point out my recent one I mentioned in the class is the way in which Saul is presented seems to indicate his spiritual shift to the side, because he's giant like the Canaanites. He's going to lead like the Canaanites. His moral compass seems rooted in the culture of the tribes of that time. You know, Gibeah being his area. His behavior really matches more of a Canaanite king than an Israelite king. And on earlier readings through, some of those literary details didn't always shine to the top as they did reading for the class this time. What's something that you have a question about? Even if the text doesn't answer it, maybe it will spark us some conversation or consideration. But what's something in the text itself that you say, hey, I really want to know more about that?
I thought it was kind of strange that Samuel never told him he was going to be king.
Yeah, there's something interesting about both 1st and 2nd Samuel. And let me describe it this way. The text of Judges seems to have a very strong line of information where one thing leads to the next thing. The text of 1st and 2nd Samuel doesn't have that same historical timeline feel. And we are also missing elements. Like, hey, where's there's a lot of stuff that isn't just spelled out like it's spelled out for David or Jesus. Saul isn't given this kind of full backstory. And there's a lot of things we just don't know. And so I think that's really interesting. In addition to kind of capturing and recognizing that point, what else? Thinking through chapters 8 through 15, what primary lessons about God should we be paying attention to? What do we learn about God as God is presented to us through these people's lives? Bobby?
In chapter 15, God tells Saul what he wanted to do. He wanted to go and destroy the Amalekites. Saul went and done what he wanted to do. Took the things that looked good to him, and done what he wanted to do with them, and then, in the end, he said he had performed the commandments of the Lord. Well, if we leave out one of God's commandments, we hadn't done what he said.
Yeah, you do see that instructive model taking place where God is giving kind of clear expectations, and Saul seems to never consider what God wants Saul to do. He's very self-focused in some ways. I also find a sense of patience in God. There's a consistent level of spiritual disengagement by Saul, but God doesn't dispense of Israel because of Saul's poor leadership, and God is patient there. He's also patient with Saul. Saul's not a great paragon of virtue in this sense, especially in his falling down period, and there's a period of time where God is allowing this to play out for all the reasons that God wants him to do so. And I'll add this further. This is a great illustration of the value of your heart in the equation of spirituality. Your heart matters. Your character matters. In the Proverbs context, out of your heart flows a man is an illustration that comes a couple different ways in the Proverbs and the Psalms. And Jesus talks about the same concept, that through a person's behavior, you're actually seeing their heart. And so we get to know about Saul's heart through his actions. Bobby pointed out 1 Samuel chapter 15 as a text. Debbie?
So I also thought that was very interesting again in 1 Samuel 12, verse 22. It comes up again that the Lord will not forsake his people for his great namesake. I know you brought that up before, and I was interested to see that again.
Yeah, and that's a theme that reappears. Even with the sometimes disjointed storytelling or narrative aspects of the 1 Samuel text, those thematic elements are really what's important. And also remember this, I've said this before, the way these Old Testament histories are written are appropriate in the culture in which they're written, even though we might be expecting our histories to follow a different route. And it's much different than even the Gospels and the book of Acts as historical books are presented to us. Each of those four Gospels are written with purposed, persuasive destinations. And when Luke and Acts together is a persuasive text. Here it is. This is also a persuasive text, by the way, but it's a different kind. I'm going to cue you into something. A way to think through 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles is to think about how they portray the kings. As a sense, and this is like an exercise to figure out what's going on. If they were written as propaganda, and they're not, but if they were, and you're thinking through them, what they're saying is pretty simple. The David line is the good king line. And they really emphasize a lot of the good things that David did. They don't ignore the bad. They place it in context. But David is presented as the pinnacle of kingship. Saul and Solomon are presented not as the pinnacle of kingship. If you were trying to lead Israel again, and you not only were a descendant of David, but also someone who wanted his people to follow in a wholesome way, then you would want to emphasize the impact of good David-like leadership upon a nation and how it would go. And so you can see how that would affect the reading of it. You would read through it and think, okay, yeah, this is what my king should look like. He should look like David. He should be spiritual, but also have a good sense of shepherding. We want someone like that. And so it helps you kind of understand the persuasive side of a historical text. It should persuade us to understand about these kingship principles. So chapter 15 here is again an interaction between Samuel and Saul. It's toward the end of things for Samuel. And you'll notice chapter 15 verse 1, the text reads this way. And Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people of Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. It's important to kind of catch, if you haven't forgotten, Saul's perception of prophets, of leaders of this kind, is I buy you and you speak for me. That seems to be the cultural expectation of the Canaanites, but also sometimes the kings fall in that model as well. So when this prophet comes to him and tells him, hey, look, basically, you're king because God sent me to you, and I had a hand in it. He's leveraging that relationship in a kind of dangerous way. Because he's going to the king who has control completely over the entire area and giving every ounce of his, pay attention to what I have to say next. Because you're king, because God made you king. And God sent me to tell you. The last time that had happened in the text was all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 8, and it did not go well. So there's a reminder of God's role at this point, and the intention is to remind Saul of his need to be obedient. It's the same kind of thing that you would probably naturally catch in the text. And in some ways, that's going to have to be part of the narrative telling of the things going forward. The things are going to go forward where this text continues, and I'm going to jump ahead to verse 10 for right now. The word of the Lord came to Samuel, and this is a key one. I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning. And it was told Samuel that Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be you to the Lord, for I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And Samuel said, What is the bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction. It's the classic dodging answer. I'm going to give you these instructions. When I get back, I expect everything to go exactly as planned. Comes back, oh, we did exactly what we were told. Why do I hear sheep? I'm not supposed to hear sheep. To put it in the moral equivalency zone, it's like going in after telling your kids or your friends or whomever, hey, do this task, clean your room, and you come in and what they've actually done is taken the blanket and pulled it over everything on top of the bed. That room's not clean. Everybody knows the room's not clean. In this case, everyone knows that Saul's heart is not clean. And he does the exact same thing that Adam and Eve struggled with, the exact same thing that Aaron and everyone else surrounding their false worship of the golden calf did, and they're doing exactly what we do. Well, the woman thou gavest me. Well, the serpent deceived me. Well, the people, we didn't know where you were, Moses, and out of the fire came this golden calf. I'm not even quite sure where it came from. It just was there. There were people rose to play. What am I going to do? Like, I can't stop them. And then now we get to this one again. Well, I mean, the people kept it. It's for the people. Do any of those play well for the ones who are trying to make excuses? The simple theological connection is a quick recognition. What Adam and Eve did, what Aaron did, what Saul did, and by the way, what Solomon and even David did, is the same thing that you and I do. When challenged, caught in the act or not, we make excuses or we dodge. And by the way to include David in it is to think about his response when the prophet comes to him and tells him a grand story. And his response is so indignant, he should be killed. And he had to have someone say, "You're the man." Like, that's you. But before he would catch it and understand how sorrowful his behavior had become. That text there, by the way, chapter 15, verse 14, is one of the great power statements of the Old Testament. If you're a highlighter or a note taker in your Bible, that is really similar to a number of other events, even in the text of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 15 has a similar feel to it. There it was the soldiers, here it was the people. But in the end, Samuel, as a servant of God, ergo God, has had enough of it. As the text continues, verse 17, the Lord has rejected you. God had made him a king. God could remove him as a king. And in the end, the basic question, why is it that he wouldn't just obey? It's similar to the questions we asked about the priests and their sons. Like, why wouldn't he just do that? So that brings us to this last question as we close out. Thinking about this text going forward in the classes upcoming and in our own studies of the Scriptures, it's really important for us to ponder, why is it that I don't just obey? We can put it off on all these other sources, but in the end, we're still asking that same basic question. And there's all kinds of edges to the answer that have to be sorted out. Is it because my heart's not wholly committed to God? Is it because I've allowed myself to be persuaded by false doctrine? Did I get my eyes ensnared in things of the world? Have I forgotten who redeemed me? Those are all biblical answers to that powerful question. Next week we'll be moving forward and continuing in our survey of 1 Samuel, and it's going to talk a lot about the anointing of Saul, David that is, and the transition that takes place. And there's a lot of chaos in this text. There's a lot of stress and strain on David that when we pause and think about it, it helps us maybe appreciate the character of David more and see the bigger struggle that takes place throughout the course of his life. But right now, as we close our class, I'm going to ask Bobby to do so with prayer. And so, Bobby, would you close our study with prayer, please?
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you so very kindly for blessing us to be able to assemble tonight and study more about your holy and divine word. I ask that you will help us to be obedient unto you in every way and never hesitate to share the good news of the gospel with others so that your kingdom will grow and many souls will be saved. Though all is well with us, I ask that you will help us to remember those who have lost loved ones and are grieving, for those who are sick. We pray for them. And we ask your forgiveness for our